Welcome to the Rob Call Bottom Up Show, sponsored by opednews.com, available on Pacifica Radio Network, Progressive Radio Network, iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and more. I'm Rob Call, the host of the show. I'm the publisher of opednews.com and the author of a new book coming out in May, The Bottom Up Revolution. My guest for this show is Paul Craig Roberts. He's a former assistant Secretary of the Treasury and was associate editor and columnist for the Wall Street Journal, columnist for Business Week and the Scripps Howard News Service. He was a nationally syndicated columnist for Creators Syndicate in Los Angeles. He's the chairman of the Institute for Political Economy, and his website is paulcraigroberts.org. Great to have you back on the show, Paul.
Hey, Rob, I'm glad to be talking to you again.
Yeah, so you're always stirring up stuff here. So let's start with your take on the government. You wrote an article, "No one trusts the U.S. government, not even the American people." Talk about, because interestingly, I just wrote an article that I think that the Democrats should put together a kind of an umbrella issue that looks at too big to fail businesses, billionaires, and we can talk about that, getting rid of billionaires, getting rid of, and I added getting rid of big government, or at least looking at it and making sure that it's not being abused and it's as lean as possible. And I've already been attacked by Democrats for attacking the Holy Grail or something. But it's about government. I think that the stats you gave are startling. I mean, twice as many respondents regard the U.S. government to be a top problem than regard immigration. Americans see Washington to be 6 times the problem that healthcare is. Some pretty amazing numbers there. And so it seems to me that we need to be looking at the size and power of big government. And I think most on the left would agree about military, but it's also about welfare for big corporations and things like that too. But so what did your article say? Talk about your...
Well, Rob, best as I remember, that was I was just reporting on polls, both domestic and I think foreign polls, which, if I remember correctly, view the United States as the biggest threat to peace and have less confidence in us than they have in Iran and Russia and China. So, and I think I just said, well, actually, the foreigners don't think very highly of us, but apparently neither do the American people, because then I gave this other poll results, and I don't remember which polls they were.
It was Gallup.
Gallup. So
no, wait. It was a Gallup poll. It was a Gallup poll.
Yeah. So I was just reporting on the polls. I think that people, and it may help your bottom up revolution. They're beginning to catch on that they get told a lot of lies. And, the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq didn't materialize, the nukes in Iran didn't materialize, and so on and so on. And they are now suspicious of all the good news about the economy, because they don't experience it in their own life. When you can't get a full-time job and you have to work part-time jobs, and at some point all the propaganda wears out, and I think they see through this Venezuela thing, and so they kind of feel like they can't trust Washington, that there's some kind of agenda running the show that's got nothing to do with them, and they get told all these explanations that fit whatever the agendas are, but it's nothing that's doing them any good. So I think that's basically my take on it. If it could well be the establishment, the deep state, the oligarchs, whatever we want to call them, whatever they are, that they were counting on simply propagandizing everybody, and everybody would forever go along with the agenda because they spin it in a way that is supposed to appeal to the public, or at least cover up what they're really doing. But it looks like it may not be working for them, that there's more and more suspicion. There's more and more suspicion of the print and TV media. There's more and more suspicion of all the interference with the alternative media on the internet. All of the efforts of Google and Facebook and Twitter and everybody to filter things with control algorithms and so on. And so public, we may be getting, for the first real time, the kind of public suspicion that is needed if things actually are to ever change.
It's the old line, you're not paranoid if it's really happening.
Well, yeah, it's entirely possible that they're losing control of the explanations. People who control the explanation, you know, and also the public has to notice that whether it's CNN or MSNBC or New York Times or Washington Post, they all say exactly the same thing. It's almost like they're reading the same script handed to them. You never find any difference in the coverage. You know, the story in one on Venezuela, for example, is the same as the story on the other. Whatever they want to talk about, it's always exactly the same. It's almost the same.
And also the absence of other aspects of the story.
Right.
Not just what they're telling, it's what they're not saying too.
Right. They're all the same. What they don't tell you is the same, and what they do tell you. And, you know, I got into the media by accident. That wasn't my intention. It was just that there was a great media interest in the explanations that I was giving people. And so I got drug in by the media. It wasn't my career goal. I wasn't set out to be a journalist. But in those days, you would get some different explanations. And to figure out, to get some idea of what really might be going on, you had to read a variety of sources because there would be some different takes, and some articles would have some of the information and the other newspaper wouldn't, or the other TV show wouldn't, and so on. But today, you just turn to one, you know what the official story is. Saves a lot of time. It saves a lot of time, but you basically cannot find out from the American print and TV media what is the state of anything in reality. And
so we try at Op-Ed News to make up for that.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Alternative media, you try, I try, there are other sites. And so now we have, thanks to people like you, we have a better chance of getting some idea of what might be really going on.
You know, you might want to give a shout out to Sheila Samples as well while we're doing this.
Well, is Sheila listening? You know, she's the best copy editor I have ever run across in my life. And if it weren't for her, my website's archive would have 1 trillion typos, misspellings, wrong tenses, and everything else in it.
Yeah, Sheila's been a long-term volunteer editor at opednews.com. She's one of our 3 managing editors, and she's amazing. And she's
I agree. She is amazing. You know, I've had many copy editors. You know, I've got 12 or more books, including Harvard University Press, Oxford University Press. I've had all kinds of I've never had anybody like Sheila. And, you know, sometimes I can read my own thing 6 or 8 times, and it's got 15, 20 errors in it. Still, she catches every one of them.
Yeah, she's great. So but let's stay with this topic here. No one trusts the U.S. government, not even the U.S. people. You know, I believe in some of the big aspects of government. I believe in Medicare and Social Security, and I believe in having a defense that can keep us safe. I think our military is insanely overbloated and out of control. I mean, there were reports that trillions of dollars have gone unaccountable, and that shouldn't happen. But I think that we need to take a close look at government. And I'm a lefty. I believe that we need to have some centralized functions, but I also believe that we need to do things as much as possible localized. So I'd like your thoughts about it. How would you talk to people who generally are on the left who like big government? How would you address them in talking about how big government needs to be dealt with in any way?
Well, Rob, you know, I think the old terms that are used between the conservatives and the liberals, you know, big government or little government, I don't think that's the right way to think about it. I myself believe that a society has to be humane. And so it has to have social functions that make life tolerable for everybody, whether they people who succeed or fail. You don't just, you can't just say, well, this is a Darwinian society and you either make it or you go down. So you know, government has to be humane. There has to be a safety net. There has to be public provided goods and services. There's no doubt about it. So I think that argument is the wrong argument. Like you, Social Security, yes, of course you have to have it. You're not a civilized country if you don't, unless, of course, you're a country of independent farmers who have big families. Then they have their own Social Security system as long as you prevent the banks from taking their land away from them.
Well, that's the problem. Globalization has done everything it can to destroy independent farmers.
Right, that's right. So I don't think it's a question of whether you have a social safety net or aspects of socialism. In fact, I think we should have a one-payer national health system. The costs would drop dramatically because in our current system there has to be profit at every level, and then on top of, so that pushes the cost way up, and then on top of that, at every level they have to have all of this regulation and fraud prevention. And that pushes the cost up. If you look at how much of a time is spent in complying with anti-fraud paperwork as opposed to medical care, it's frightening how much time, how many resources, how much of the doctor's time it draws away.
And what we've seen is this incredible lie and fraud that it would cost more. Yeah, the reality is that it would save corporations a ton. I think it's 170 million people who have health insurance through corporations. Those corporations would be able to save a ton of money on health insurance and pay people more. Mm-hmm. And not only that, but people would be able to leave their jobs because they wouldn't be addicted to health insurance from one company.
That's right. I think the cost would collapse dramatically because it takes profit out at every level.
Yeah. But but I'm asking you to criticize government too.
Yeah, but I am. I'm getting on it. I was just clearing the deck that I'm not some conservative who wants to be sure there's no social welfare system.
Okay.
So what I think, the way you think about government, and I think the only accurate way, is you have to look at it basically as a private enterprise, and it's used by the organized interest groups. So the government is not an independent factor. It is a puppet of the military security complex, Wall Street, the pharmaceutical industries, the extractive industries, timber, mining, oil. I have enough experience in the congressional staff and in the administration to know who writes the bills. It's not the Congress or the staff members. The bills are written by the powerful lobby groups that fund the campaigns, including the Israel lobby. They write all the bills, they bring them and hand them to the senators and the congressmen, and that's where the bills come from.
Oh, wait a second, though, but you said including the Israel lobby, that's going to get you labeled as an anti-Semite.
Well, if you even complain that Israel's hurting itself by the way it treats the Palestinians, that makes you an anti-Semite. And if I was Jewish, it would make me a self-hating Jew.
That's what they call me.
Okay, so I think that anti-Semite it used to mean somebody who hates Jews and wants to do harm to Jews, but now it means somebody who wants to protect them by saying, hey, don't do that. That's not a good idea. You know, like if you tell them you don't want to go step on a rattlesnake, you might get bit. Oh, you're an anti-Semite.
Yeah.
So I'm not worried about that. I think they've overused it to try to shut people up, and it's wearing out. But what I'm not saying anything now, especially about the Israel lobby. I'm just saying any powerful group that makes campaign contributions, this is the source of the agenda for the government. And all you have to do is look around. I mean, you know, look at Wall Street. It got deregulated, right? They got rid of Glass-Steagall, right? And we've had a crisis ever since. And a new response to the crisis, which if we get to it later, probably means even a greater crisis in the future. We can't get out of wars. Trump can't normalize relations with Russia because the military security complex needs an enemy to justify its 1,000 billion annual budget. You know, $1,000 billion is a lot of money. You've got to have some justification. So it's got to be a big enemy. Non-state terrorists don't qualify.
But in a sense, what you're saying is that government has already been privatized by lobbyists and industry.
That's right. And it you know, really almost from the earliest days it's been, but as its scope got bigger, you see, it used to be the states were more powerful. And so there was more constraint on the government because it was local. It was directly affecting people. When Lincoln destroyed states' rights, then you got more centralization, and then you got more of it during the Great Depression, so that the power is centralized in a way that it's easy for the lobby groups that essentially provide the campaign funds for the members, including not just the House and Senate, but also the president. And if you look at who gets appointed to government positions, it's usually people from the interest groups. You know, this has been, look what they've done to the environmental movement ever since Cheney, ever since Dick Cheney and the George W. Bush administration. They put in polluters and all that to run the EPA and all. So, you look, there was an economist at the University of Chicago named George Stigler. He won the Nobel Prize. He's dead and gone, but when I was a student, he was a very important economist, wrote one of the main theory books that people used in graduate schools. And he said, these many decades ago, that the problem with government regulation of business, and he of course conceded that it was needed. He wasn't arguing against regulation, but he said the problem with it is that it always gets, the regulatory agency of the government always gets captured by the industry that it's regulating it.
And so what happens is the regulations end up protecting industries, making it even better for them.
Yeah, protecting them or giving them special rights, privileges, opening up public resources to them, you know, letting them plunder. So and I remember I was a graduate student, and this made a big impression on me, and it's affected the way I've thought about government ever since. And so, yes, it's privatized in the sense that its agenda comes from the campaign contributors.
So now we need to do a brief show ID, and then when we come back, I'd like you to talk about what solutions you would propose. This is the Rob Call Bottom Up Show, sponsored by opednews.com, available on Pacifica Radio Network, Progressive Radio Network, iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud. I'm Rob Call. I'm the host of the show. I've got a new book coming out, The Bottom Up Revolution, in May. My guest for this show is Paul Craig Roberts, the former Assistant Secretary of the Treasury. His website is paulcraigroberts.org. So, Paul, what do we do about this?
Well, Rob, it's hard to do anything. One is, if you could get money out of politics, that would help. For example, the big industry groups would still have a lot of influence, but if your election is not dependent on their money, you're not their vassal. So if you could get the campaign money out of politics, you would have a situation where there would be more independence on the part of members of the House and Senate. And they could consider other things, not just the demands from their campaign contributors. So that would be one big improvement if money left politics. Another big improvement would be if you could somehow, everyone could understand that any form of regulation, it can have unintended consequences, it can be dangerous, it's not a panacea, and so you have to look at it with skepticism. Whether you're for big government or little government, the regulation can have unintended consequences, it can be abused, it can do the opposite of what you thought, and this is often the case, and such that the focus stays on this regulation. If you had, and you have to have the same skepticism about people who tell you you don't need regulation. For example, when Alan Greenspan and Larry Summers and the SEC chairman told the Congress that Brooksley Born should not be permitted to regulate over-the-counter derivatives because markets are self-regulating, people should have said, wait just a minute, wait, what do you mean? Everybody knows that over-the-counter derivatives are very dark, opaque instruments. Of course, they've got to be regulated. And she knew that, and she was the head of the Commodity Futures Trading Corporation, which was supposed to be regulating these, but the deregulators came in. Greenspan, Larry Summers, I forget the SEC chairman's name there, but he was a guy with a lot of prestige at the time, and they all went in and blocked her and went to Congress and testified and said, we have to prevent this. And so she wasn't allowed to regulate them. And so, well, you know what happened? We had that fantastic blow up in 2007 and 2008. And the consequences of that are ongoing. It's out of the news and people don't know about them. And it's all been packaged and hidden away. But
like what? What are some of the unknown consequences?
Well, the response of the Fed was to, its main constituents, so the Federal Reserve, are the big New York banks. So, and of course, the executives of these big banks are the board of directors of the New York Federal Reserve Bank. I don't know if you knew that or not, but that's the case. So, and the New York Federal Reserve Bank is the operating arm of the Fed. That's where all the market participation comes from, if they're going to intervene in the bond market, the stock market, the currency market, wherever. So instantly they went into the mode of protecting the New York banks. And what was that? Well, they printed huge sums of money to buy up the troubled derivatives from the banks, such that the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve expanded from something like 800 or 900 billion to over $4 trillion. Now, that printed money, if that printed money had gotten directly into the consumer economy, we would have had a hyperinflation in the prices of goods and services, food. We would have had a hyperinflation because the output of goods and services did not grow by anything like the supply of money. So where did the money go? Well, it went into financial assets, and we got this fantastic bull market, this huge rise in stock prices, rise in bond prices. The way you get low and zero interest rates, you drive up bond prices, because the interest rate and the price of bond, they move in opposite directions. So if the bond price goes way up, the interest rate goes way down, and vice versa. So we now have this Ponzi scheme of this, what is it, 26,000 Dow Jones, and it's based on all the money that the Fed pumped out purchasing troubled securities from the banks, and all the money went into stock prices.
It was stock price inflation instead of service and products.
Right. And now, but you see, but the reality doesn't support the price because there's not that kind of profits. I mean, if you look at the price earnings ratio, they've gone up radically. The profits don't justify these. Real retail sales don't justify it. Growth in consumer incomes don't justify it. And so they have to keep it propped up. So every time the market tries to come down to adjust, the Fed steps in and pushes it back up by buying S&P futures. They go in and buy S&P futures and stops the decline in the market. So you see how many times the market's tried to go down and it's arrested. So we have this propped up market.
And the other way that's happening is also with stock buybacks. That's a huge problem.
That helps the Fed keep the market up.
And that's also what happened with this Trump tax break, that 85% went to these big corporations and the extremely wealthy. And that's what they ended up doing with it. They did stock buybacks that produced the same effect, right?
I don't know if the tax cut had anything to do with the buybacks. The buybacks are cheap for them when there's such low interest rates, because it doesn't cost them anything in carrying charge. And what the buybacks do is, Congress years ago passed a law that you couldn't pay an executive more than $1 million a year and still deduct it as a cost of business, unless it's performance related. And performance related means the stock price goes up. If the stock price goes up, they can have multi-millions of bonuses. So most of the income of the top management comes from bonuses, not from their contracted salary. And so what drives the bonuses up is they use all the profits of the firm and any money they can borrow to buy their own stock, because when you buy your own stock, it pushes the price up. So then they say, well, look, the price of stock's gone up, so I can collect all of these bonuses, these multi-million dollars of bonuses. So this has been a big contributor to the worsening of the income distribution. But probably the most important aspect of this is it shows you that they're not really profitable enough to justify the share price, because if they were actually making the kind of profits that accounted for those high share prices, they would be reinvesting the money, not buying back the stock. They would say, wow, look how profitable we are, let's expand the business. So the money would be going into plant and equipment.
Could that be regulated? Could there be regulations put in place to prevent buybacks like that?
It probably should be.
Yeah.
I don't know the history of it or why. I think they're probably rare. in past decades. Like I say, I'm not knowledgeable about this, but I don't remember in all my years of graduate study and in the years when I was an economics professor, this being an issue, buybacks. So I think it's something that's new, and I think it came in because of the regulation holding down corporate pay to $1 million. See, like I said, every regulation has an unintended consequence.
Exactly, yes.
This is a good example. You know, I think if they hadn't passed that, trying to say, well, you know, how can you pay the president more than $1 million, president of a company? And so, well, we'll make it, if you do, you can't write it off as a cost. Then, unless they said it's performance related. So then they find some way to create a fake performance and they buy back stock.
So what do you think about this new talk about raising the income tax over $10 million to 70%?
I think when you start raising taxes on investment income, you discourage savings and investment. And it used to be, we understood that the way an economy grew was by encouraging savings and investment. Now, in my opinion, what has been far more hurtful to ordinary people than lowering the tax rates is the offshoring of the jobs. The minute the corporations began moving the high productivity, high value added jobs that paid middle class incomes offshore, this is when they began impoverishing the workforce. And this is when the real serious changes in the fairness of the income distribution began. Because when you move a job offshore, say when this started, for example, an American manufacturing worker making $25 an hour, and that job could be moved to China at the time for 25 cents an hour. Well, this enormous difference in the cost of labor went directly into profits, went directly into bonuses to management and into capital gains to shareholders. And this is the way these huge fortunes were made. When I was Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, in the Forbes 400 list, the 400 richest people, there were only 2 billionaires. And only one was a multi-billionaire. He had maybe $3 billion. See, today, if you've only got $3 billion, you're not even on the list. Now, that's a huge difference. I mean, I think the guy.
Yeah, I think it should be. I've been writing about this for 8 years. I think that it should be illegal to be a billionaire. There's no reason that anybody needs that much money. I've asked anthropologists, what would tribes and bands do if somebody owned half of the resources of the tribe? The answer is pretty consistent. It's either kick them out, treat them like they're insane, or kill them.
Well, you see, Rob, this is. I agree with you, but this is the wrong way to go about it. Because the reason they're billionaires is because they were allowed to move American jobs offshore, abroad, to take them away from American people and give them to the Chinese and the Indians and others.
How do we fix it?
Well, you obviously, well, you can't for this reason. Why did they do this? A lot of the corporations really didn't want to move offshore because they didn't want to desert their hometowns. They were important people in their hometown. I mean, I know from personal experience of a large firm, the president, the chairman were locals. The headquarters was local, always been there. They were important people in the community. They supported all kinds of organizations. The corporation provided all kinds of employment. And they wanted to leave it that way. And Wall Street came to them and said, get your butt offshore right now, or we're going to fund a takeover and take your company over, and then we'll move it offshore.
Wall Street? I mean, I keep thinking
Wall Street.
Globalization would be part of the problem.
Wall Street, investment bankers. Because they said, look, how much more money this corporation will make if you're not paying people in Akron, Ohio wages, but you're paying them in China. And so you get this company offshore now, or we're going to fund a takeover and we'll move it offshore. So you see what I mean? It comes right back to Wall Street.
So you're talking Goldman Sachs and that their ilk.
Yeah. But you see now, because when they busted up Glass-Steagall, any bank can be a commercial bank. See, that's what Glass-Steagall separated commercial, can be an investment bank. Glass-Steagall separated commercial from investment banking. Well, when you repeal it, then every bank can be an investment bank. And so it's not just Goldman Sachs, it's JP Morgan Chase, it's Citibank.
The usual
California banks, the Bank of America, and I think to a much lesser extent, Wells Fargo. It does other things.
But they're the usual suspects. They're always the ones that come up for this, though.
Yeah, but you see, again, you have to understand it doesn't really originate with them.
No,
it originates in a series of things, and everyone sees an opportunity in it. And so everyone jumps in to push it in their direction, and they did. Look, suppose the Soviet communism had never collapsed. If it hadn't, probably China would not have opened to foreign capital, and neither would it have India. India was socialist. China wouldn't and didn't want any foreign capital. They didn't trust capitalism in a socialist country. China certainly wasn't going to let foreign capital in China. But when the Soviet Union collapsed, it created the impression there was only one way to run the economic system, the way the United States and the West do. Don't you remember The End of History? Don't you remember the book, The End of History? There's only one economic and political system, and we have it. And this propaganda affected India and China. And they both changed and went capitalist and gave up the socialism. So they opened up, and they had vast, underutilized supplies of labor. And that's why the labor is so cheap. It's just huge overhangs of workers on the labor market. And as long as that lasts, the labor is going to be cheap compared to what it was here. So the offshoring starts. Some people did it on their own. Others who didn't want to do it for the reasons I told you, they were part of the local community, got pushed into it with threats. So off go millions of high productivity, high value added jobs that produce middle class incomes, and also produce tax base for cities, counties, and states. So now we have to think about it this way, Rob. The external cost, the social cost of offshoring the jobs, that is, the cost not borne by the firms that offshore the jobs. Let's take, say, Apple. Apple moves its production to China. All right. It lowers its labor costs, but the cost of that was all kinds of lost tax base for cities, counties, states, trouble for pension funds, lost income for former manufacturing workers who were working here. You see, so when you add up all those costs, I'm sure they exceed the increased profits that Apple got from moving offshore. But Apple doesn't have to bear those costs. They are external, they are social costs. It's the same, it's like polluters. If I've got some kind of industrial or manufacturing enterprise and I produce pollutants and I dump them on the environment, then that's an external cost to me. The firm didn't pay for that cost. The environment is going to pay for it.
All right, so we need to do another show ID, and then we're going to talk about externalities, which,
yeah. So,
you know, years ago, I had you on with Noam Chomsky, which was a lot of fun. And he's another person who always brings up at the costs of externalities. So quick show ID, and then we'll come right back. It's the Rob Call Bottom Up Show, sponsored by opednews.com. Available on Pacifica Radio Network, Progressive Radio Network, iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, at opednews.com/podcasts. My guest for this show is Paul Craig Roberts. He's the former Assistant Secretary of the Treasury. He's the chairman of the Institute for Political Economy, and his website is paulcraigroberts.org. So, Paul, you're talking about externalities. Now, my understanding is we should be making companies accountable for the costs of externalities.
Yeah, and they have been to some extent. And sometimes the way you try to make them accountable actually plays in their hands. You know, like this carbon tax. I'm not quite sure that is the way to handle externalities, where you let them bid for who gets to be the polluter. You know, there's so many. Once this starts, it's hard to control it, because on the surface, to ordinary people, it can look like a good solution, but it can actually be a very self-serving thing. And if you try to make that point, you can get shouted down. And since everybody isn't trained to see these things, they don't know who to believe either. And it's hard to control these. This is why I think ideological conflict within a society is very dangerous, because it prevents unity. It creates disunity. And to deal with the kinds of problems we're talking about, you have to have a lot of unity. The people who are left-wing, they're usually that way because they've got some incorrect interpretation of how the world works. The same for people who are right-wing. They've got some wrong interpretation of how the world works. And so out of this, there come ideological clashes. I try to avoid any kind of ideological position and try just to look at the facts, look at the reality, and then try to make a decision that works. And so I think it's wrong for conservatives to resist regulation. I think it's wrong for liberals to put so much faith in it, because, as I've said, it's
they bite back.
It bites back, and I think that it's wrong to think. And libertarians are an example of this. They think that, well, you know, people in the private sector, they're moral and make the right decisions. But if they get in government, they're corrupted by power and they make the wrong decisions. Now, of course, the liberals believe the opposite. They believe people in the private sector are greedy and selfish and make the wrong decisions, but if the same people are in the public sector, they do the right thing for the people. Well, both of them are full of it. The government is a private organization. It serves the most powerful private interests. The agenda of these private interests determine the agenda of the government.
Yeah, the one solution you gave was get money out of politics.
Get money out of politics, but also just have people aware that government is something that whoever can get their hands on it uses it for their benefits. It's a career thing. You know, when I was Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, one of the things that struck me was that the people in the government weren't there to help people or to do the president's agenda. They were there for their personal career. And they were using their office not to advance whatever agenda the president had, but to advance the agenda of some group whose purposes they were serving while in office. So when they left, they would get a very high-paying, secure job.
Now, one element that I think is important for government is transparency. You know, they say that sunlight is the best curative. Is there a way, do you think, that we could be assessing the behavior of these people so that they were actually measured as in terms of how well they're working for their constituents or for the people rather than for special interests?
I don't know. Probably not. Look, think about national security. They'll simply say national security, stamp it classified. Or, for example, take a property owners association. The board. The board will hold closed meetings, and the members can't find out. And you go and you say, well, we're going to sue you because there are sunshine laws. The county has to have open meetings, and then they'll come and then they'll prove, well, you see, we're not a government. We're not affected by the sunshine. People, if they don't want their decisions examined, and not entirely for bad or wrong reasons. Sometimes you have to make a decision that is going to make an enemy of certain people, and you just assume that not be known because you've got enough trouble and you don't need this. It's not just people who are misbehaving and hiding their misbehavior. So there are good reasons sometimes not to reveal things, even though there are plenty of bad reasons. I think that things get put under classified ratings just in order that they can continue to exercise power, and they can continue to do whatever they want. They got an agenda different from what people think.
I think that transparency and open government, and even in non-government, is a very bottom-up kind of a thing. It's where everybody gets to see what's going on when it comes to decision-making processes that affect everybody. Yeah. And the opposite, where you have secrets, where you have opaque government and decision-making, that's top-down, and it's designed to, like you say, help people to hold on to their power, and that's wrong.
Well, I agree with you. It is wrong, but it's sort of the nature of government. It's even the nature of small things like property owners associations.
So far, we can change it, and that's what we need to do.
Well, but you see, again, Rob, I would emphasize that a homogeneous, united society can, not a disunited. Well, you see, once you go multicultural, diversity, identity politics, and then you get people at each other's throats, it's very difficult because the blacks will say, well, the whites are doing this for them. Or the whites will say, well, the blacks are doing this for them. Or the women will say it about the men, or the men about the women, or homosexuals about the heterosexuals, or vice versa. When you get society so divided as ours is, you have a hell of a time because there's no unity and because everybody sees everybody else as somebody who wants to take advantage of them or victimize them.
Well, my book, in Bottom Up Revolution, what I say in that is we need to have connection consciousness. We need to understand that we're all connected to each other. We're all connected to nature. And that's the way that we shift from I to we thinking. And it's the we thinking that's going to unite us so that we can stand up to these powerful forces.
Well, you'll first have to get rid of identity politics because it disunites us. And it is the leading ideology of the Democratic Party.
How would you define identity politics?
Well, identity politics came out of cultural Marxism. And it has replaced the traditional Marxism, in which you had the working class and the capitalists. You had class interests. You had the class interests of the working class, the class interests of the capitalists, of the bourgeoisie, and these interests were, in Marx, irreconcilable. And so what identity politics does, there's no longer a working class, it's no longer a capitalist. There's the heterosexual white male. He is the victimizer. He is taking the position of the capitalist. And everybody else, the women, the racial minorities who worldwide are not minorities, the homosexuals, transgender, they're all victims of the white male. And so it's just a form of Marxism, except that the working class in identity politics is now the Trump deplorables.
Is now the what?
The Trump deplorables.
Oh, the Trump deplorables. Okay.
So Hillary wrote off the working class. They're the Trump deplorables. They're a bunch of white victimizers, and that's who elected Trump. And all these other good people are the victims. And you can see it now everywhere. It's everywhere. It's everywhere. And so almost every debate falls in this thing of identity politics. And it's now the official ideology of the Democratic Party.
So what's the solution?
I don't know. You know, I'd like to go back to the old Marxism, the working class and the capitalist. Because,
no, but that was not just Marxism, that was the capitalism of the 60s too.
Well, but it was Marxism. This came from Marx, and it had a long tradition, and it was the socialist, and it all came out of Marx. And
are you embracing Marxism?
Well, people don't even know what Marxism means, so I can't really answer that. I'm just saying that this distinction was once useful in that the Democratic Party represented the labor unions or the workforce, and the Republican Party represented the business. And so there was balance in the system because they got their funding from different places. So the Democrats were supported by the labor unions, and the Republicans were supported by business contributions. So there was balance in the political system. Nobody could run away with it. But what happened with the Clintons and the beginning of offshoring, the industrial unions disappeared.
Yes. Yeah, they're down to next to nothing.
And so where does the Democrats get the money? From the same people the Republicans do. The same people. So now both parties are funded by the same groups: the military security complex, Wall Street, the pharmaceuticals, the energy, mining. You see what I'm saying? So there's no longer any balance in the political system. There was no difference. What was the difference between George W. Bush and Obama? Zilch. Same wars, same lies, same everything. Who wrote the Obamacare? You think Obama did it right? No, the insurance companies, the private insurance companies wrote it. Why? Because, wow, look at the policies. Everybody you have to pay these premiums or you get fined. And furthermore, the policy for most people, you can't afford to use it because the co-pays and the deductions are so high.
And when that went into effect, insurance company stocks all went up.
Because their profits went up, because they wrote the bill. You know, the Democrats, I'm sure the political Democrats in Washington know, but the people out there, they don't understand. This was written by the insurance companies for the insurance companies.
Yeah.
They don't know that. And so they're out defending Obamacare. They're defending the profits of the insurance companies. So that's the big thing. When you had a working class, and moreover, when you had a working class, that was a form of unity because the blacks were working in the auto factories with the whites, and they had the same interests. They wanted good working conditions, good benefits, good pay. They had no reason to be at each other's throat. They were unified against the employer. Well, all this has been broken up now. Whites they victimize blacks, and the blacks are taught hate whites because look what they've done to us, and blah blah and all. So the whole
doesn't globalization and globalism have a role in this?
What globalism is, it reduces the constraints on private corporations from plundering. It's easier for them to plunder. And that's what the Asian Free Trade Treaty, the Atlantic Free Trade Treaty, or whatever partnerships, whatever they're going to call them, what those do, they have nothing to do with free trade. They remove the ability of corporations to have to obey the laws of the countries in which they operate.
And regulations.
And regulation.
Yeah.
In other words, France has a law against GMOs. Well, under that free trade partnership, whatever they call the damn thing, if Monsanto can sue the French government because this law interferes with their profits.
Right.
And the lawsuit is not settled in a French court. It's settled in a corporate tribunal.
Yeah, but with unnamed people possibly.
By corporate.
Yeah. So we got a couple of minutes left. I want to get your ideas on the Democratic primary and their candidates. Have any thoughts about any of them?
I don't think any of them can make any difference. And I think the Democrats are ruining themselves. They shouldn't be lining up against white people. There's no payoff in that. They shouldn't be carrying on about Russiagate. There's no evidence of Russiagate. It's a hoax created by the military security complex to stop Trump from normalizing relations with Russia because they need an enemy. And the Democrats jumped on it because, they were so mad Hillary didn't win. And
an excuse for Hillary's failure, too.
Yeah, and an excuse. They're ruining themselves just like the mainstream media is with the American public. They look at this. They shouldn't be lining up against Maduro in Venezuela. Maduro is elected. This other guy is somebody we pulled out of a hat. He's never even been a candidate in the presidential election. How can he be appointed president by us? It's stupid for the Democrats to line up with this. It's stupid of them to insist on everybody having to make an apology every time they open their mouth.
Yeah. So you have no opinion that any of the 12 announced candidates are any better than any of the others?
No. See, Bernie Sanders, if he had stood up to Hillary, I would say, yeah. But he showed he didn't have any guts. He didn't have the balls to say, hey, you just stole the nomination from me. If he had done something, but see, he got run over too. He just let him run over him. You have these women. I like their guts. But they take positions that are too far out, and then they end up having to apologize because they said something. So every one of them has had to apologize.
You're talking about Omar and Ilhan, those who have been criticizing Israel.
Well, I think it's legitimate to criticize Israel.
Yeah.
And
I agree with you 100%.
So, I mean, they're not saying we got to kill the Jews or anything. They're simply making kind of criticisms that we make about the United States.
Meanwhile, got to wrap. It's the end of the show time. Thanks so much for being on the show, Paul. It's the Rob Call Bottom Up Show, sponsored by opednews.com. Available on Pacifica Radio and iTunes and Stitcher and Progressive Radio and at opednews.com/podcast. My guest for this show has been Paul Craig Roberts, former Assistant Secretary of the Treasury. His website is paulcraigroberts.org. Thanks so much for being back on the show, Paul.
Rob, I enjoyed being on your show and talking to you. I look forward to the next time.
It's always a pleasure.